do a bit of reading, not terribly long, don't panic. And then leave plenty of time for questions, because I find on this book that people really do have a lot of questions, and they're different from the questions that I get when I talk about Eisenhower or Nixon. People want to know how they felt about things. I get asked so often to talk about Kay Summersby, for example. And with Nixon, people want to know when he said, but John, that would be wrong. Did he mean wrong politically, or wrong morally, or wrong legally, or... But with Lewis and Clark, people want to know how they do it. How the hell do you go across a continent before there are trains, before there are steamboats, when nothing moves faster than the speed of a horse? And the questions are intriguing to me as well. Just to anticipate a couple, people want to know, how did they measure distance? William Clark made the map from St. Louis to Astoria, Oregon. And it's about 2,781 miles, and he was off by a mile. Now, how did he do this? Well, he did it by line of sight. He'd come around a bend in a river, and he'd see the next bend, and he'd say, that's 3/4 of a mile. Go around that bend, that's a half a mile. People want to know, how did they preserve their specimen? Well, Jefferson had taught Lewis taxidermy, and then sent him to Philadelphia to study with Dr. Persh, who taught him how to press plants. And a lot of people in this audience are old enough to remember when we used to do that in our biology and botany classes. And it's a terribly time-consuming process. But that's how he did that. Well, a bit from the book and then your questions. July 4, 1804. The men, they were in Missouri. They were north of, on the Missouri-Kansas border, north of Kansas City. On July 4, the men ushered in the day with the firing of the cannon. Private Joseph Field got bitten by a snake. Captain Lewis treated him with a poultice of Peruvian bark that drew the poison. At noon, the party pulled ashore at the mouth of a creek of some 15 yards wide, coming out of an extensive prairie on the left. As they ate, the captains questioned the voyageurs. These were French Canadians who lived in St. Louis, who had been signed up to get that keelboat upriver. And the voyageurs told them, no, nobody has named this creek. The captains thereupon named it Independence Creek. The expedition pulled over for the night on the site of an old Kansas Indian town. We camped in the plains, Clark wrote, one of the most beautiful plains I ever saw. Open and beautifully diversified, with hills and valleys all presenting themselves to the river, covered with grass and a few scattering trees, a handsome creek meandering through. The captains ordered an extra gill of whiskey distributed. As they sipped their portions, they took in their surroundings and were quite overwhelmed. The country was covered with a sweet and nourishing grass, interspersed with copses of trees, quote, spreading their lofty branches over pools, springs, or brooks of fine water, groups of shrubs covered with the most delicious fruit, is to be seen in every direction. And nature appears to have exerted herself to beautify the scenery by the variety of flowers, delicately and highly flavored, raised above the grass, which strikes and perfumes the sensation and amuses the mind. At sunset, the men fired the cannon. This was the first ever 4th of July celebration held west of the Mississippi River. Perhaps the captains grew philosophical under the influence of the whiskey, as happens to earnest young men carrying heavy responsibilities who find themselves in the Garden of Eden. As full dark comes on and the campfire burns down on the nation's birthday. Clark's last journal entry that day. So magnificent a scenery in a country thus situated far removed from the civilized world. to be enjoyed by nothing but the buffalo, elk, deer, and bear in which it abounds, and the savage Indians. Possibly the captain's puzzled over why God had created such a place and failed to put Virginians in it. Or failed to put it in Virginia. You know the story of the expedition, and I won't get into it except whatever you want to ask in question time. After the expedition, Meriwether Lewis was the nation's first celebrity, post-Revolutionary War. The great national hero, spoken of as a possible president someday. Feasted and feted at the American Philosophical Society, New Year's Day, 1807 at the White House. Praised, honored, glorified, and he fell apart. He suffered from malaria, for which he took opium. And it was within 2 years of the end of the expedition, a pill in the morning, and then a pill at noon, and then a pill in the evening. He was a frontier officer. It went with the territory that he was an alcoholic. He was a Virginian. It went with that territory that he was over his head in land speculation in Missouri. He had grown accustomed to writing out checks on the government whenever he needed anything. He had had a blank check from President Jefferson. But by the time he got to St. Louis to take up his duties as governor of Upper Louisiana, Jefferson wasn't president anymore. And as far as Madison was concerned, the Lewis and Clark expedition, that was yesterday. And the government started refusing his promissory notes. And as soon as word got to St. Louis that the government wasn't paying up on Lewis's signature, he was besieged with creditors. He was ruined financially. He believed that the expedition had been a failure, which is a startling thing to say, because it had succeeded in the number one object, which was to just get there and get back and tell us what's out there. Remember, this was 2/3 of a continent. This was the biggest unexplored territory in the world. And all of these enlightened figures were just so eager to find what the hell is out there. And he had done that. But they had also wanted, Jefferson especially, to find the Northwest Passage. The origins of this expedition were that, to complete the work that Columbus had begun. And by the beginning of the 19th century, people knew there's no way to get through Panama. You've got to go, Hudson's Bay does not open out into the Pacific. You've got to go way around South America. The last hope was the Missouri-Columbia River system would provide an all-water route, or the next best thing to it, with a couple-of-day portage. You need to remember that to people born here, mountains mean one thing. What Lewis and Clark saw was entirely different. They had anticipated, Jefferson especially, that the Rockies would resemble the Appalachian chain. But Lewis had to come back and report that, boss, that one-day portage you were hoping for took us 165 days. There's no Northwest Passage. So he thought of the expedition as a failure. He also suffered from, in Jefferson's word, melancholia, what clinical psychiatrists and psychologists today would call manic depression. And his father, who had died when Lewis was 6 years old in the Revolution, a great friend of Jefferson, had, according to Jefferson, been subject to the same melancholia. And Jefferson said, I didn't worry about it too much because I saw it when we were living together in the White House in Lewis. But knowing his father, I knew it would run its course and he would recover. And then on the expedition, there's almost no hint of depression having hit Lewis because he was having to make daily decisions and act on those decisions. Now that melancholy hit hard, along with the opium and along with the alcohol and along with the financial ruin. And there was another thing. Lewis had brought back these journals that are one of our greatest national treasures. The idea was to get them published as soon as possible. Jefferson was promising men of the Enlightenment in France and in England and all over Europe that you're going to see pretty soon. Lewis is getting these things published. Lewis suffered from all the things that I've mentioned, and for the writingest explorer who ever lived, the damnedest thing, he got a terrible case of writer's block. And it was so bad that he was lying to Jefferson about it. When are we going to see these journals? When are they going to be published? And Lewis would say, soon, soon, I'm working on them. But he wasn't. They just sat in the corner. In 1809, he set out from St. Louis to go to Washington to straighten out his affairs with the War Department and get these chits paid up. On the trip from St. Louis down the Mississippi to today's Memphis, he twice tried to jump off the keelboat and drown himself and had to be restrained by the crew. And I want to pick it up now at that point. On October 6, 1809, Lewis, Captain Neely, who was accompanying him, and their servants, Neely's slave and Lewis's manservant, who was a free mulatto, set out again. They're going now on the Natchez Trace on their way up to Washington. In the morning of October 9, they crossed the Tennessee River and camped near the present village of Collinwood, Tennessee. That night, 2 of the horses strayed. In the morning, Neely said he would stay behind to find them. Lewis decided to proceed. Neely reported, with a promise to wait for me at the first house he came to that was inhabited by white people. Late in the afternoon, Lewis arrived at Grinder's Inn, 72 miles short of Nashville. It was a rough-hewn, poorly built log cabin that took in overnight customers. Mr. Grinder was away. Lewis requested accommodations for the night. Are you alone? Mrs. Grinder asked. No, Lewis replied. 2 servants will be coming on shortly. Mrs. Grinder said that they were welcome. Lewis dismounted, unsaddled his horse, and brought the saddle in the house. He asked for some whiskey, of which he drank a bit. When Pernier, who was Lewis's manservant, and the other servant arrived, Lewis asked for his gunpowder, saying he was sure he had some in a canister. Pernier gave no distinct reply because he had been told by Neely to keep the gunpowder away from Captain Lewis. Lewis began pacing in front of the cabin. Mrs. Grinder later reported that sometimes he would seem as if he were walking up to her and would suddenly wheel around and walk back as fast as he could. She prepared a meal. Lewis entered the cabin and sat at the table, but after only a few mouthfuls, he started up, in Miss Grinder's words, speaking to himself in a most violent manner. Miss Grinder noted that his face was flushed, as if it had come on him in a fit. Lewis lit his pipe, drew a chair to the door, sat down, and remarked to Mrs. Grinder in a kindly tone, Madam, this is a very pleasant evening. After finishing the pipe, he rose and paced the yard. He sat again, lit another pipe, seemed composed. He cast his eyes, Mrs. Grinder reported, wishfully towards the west. He spoke again of what a sweet evening it was. As he sat on Mrs. Grinder's porch, looking west while the light faded from the sky, what were his thoughts? Were they of the rivers, the Missouri, the Columbia, the others? Did he recall the Arikara, the Sioux, the Mandans? Did he think of the first time he had seen Sacagawea? Did he remember that April day in 1805 when he started out from the Mandan Nation on his darling project, daring to link his name with Columbus and Captain Cook? Did he dwell on his decision at the Marias? Or were the plants, animals, birds, scenery of the Garden of Eden he had passed through commanding his imagination? If so, surely he thought of the cottonwoods, prickly pears, the gigantic trees of the Pacific coast, of grouse and woodpeckers and condors, of the grizzlies and the unbelievable buffalo herds, the pronghorns, sheep, coyotes, prairie dogs, and the other animals he had discovered and described. 168 altogether, new animal species. Did he think of those remarkable white cliffs along the Missouri, or the gates of the Rocky Mountains, or the Columbia Gorge? Or did Three Forks, that essential spot in the geography of the West where the Madison, Gallatin, and Jefferson rivers come together to form the Missouri, did it spring to his mind? Or was it Camewiat and the Shoshones who had provided the horses to get over the mountains? Perhaps it was old Toby, the Shoshone, who guided him along the Lolo Trail through the Bitterroot Mountains on that terrible march. Did he recall the Nez Perce and their fabulous ponies and their generosity? Or the journey down the western waters to the sea? Or was it his Christmas and New Year's dinners of cold water and lean elk at Fort Clatsop? It may be that he thought of the long waiting period with the Nez Perce and the one time he had been forced to turn back in his first attempt to force the Bitterroots in the spring of 1806. Or was it the Blackfeet and the only Indian fight of his life? Or did he think of the time that Cruzat shot him in the ass? One bullet, 4 holes. It's true. Did he do a roll call of the men? If he did, surely there was a special place for George Breyer. If he thought of the men, surely he thought of his co-commander, the best friend any man ever had. He had told Bernier earlier that day that General Clark had heard of his difficulties and was coming on. As the light faded, was he looking westward along the trace, expecting to see Clark ride in and set everything straight? Did one of Mrs. Grinder's dogs chase a squirrel and remind him of his Newfoundland, Seaman? Could it be that he thought of that moment of triumph when his canoes put in at St. Louis in September 1806? Or were his thoughts gloomy? Were they about his unsolvable problems? Did he agonize over his speculations and the financial ruin they had brought him? Was that awful Secretary of Bates, his number 2, with whom he had a lot of problems? Was that awful in St. Louis? Was that awful Secretary Bates foremost in his thoughts? Did he wonder why he had failed in his courtships and had no wife? Did he curse himself for his drink? He had resolved on a number of occasions to never touch whiskey again. It was going to be only light wines from then on. Did his mind dwell on Thomas Jefferson? Was he ashamed of how he had failed the man he adored? Did he think of the journals over there in the corner? In his saddlebag, not touched since he got back to St. Louis in 1806? Or did his mind avoid the past? Was he rehearsing what he would say to the Secretary of War and President Madison? Or was he yearning for more pills or more whiskey? We cannot know. We only know that he was tortured, that his pain was unbearable. Miss Grinder began to prepare a bed for him, but he stopped her and said he would sleep on the floor, explaining that since his journey to the Pacific, he could no longer sleep on a feather bed. He had Bernier bring in his bearskins and buffalo robe and spread them on the floor. While Bernier was getting the bedding, he found some powder. Miss Grinder went to the kitchen to sleep, and the servants went to the barn some 200 yards distant. Lewis began pacing in his room. This went on for several hours. Mrs. Grinder, who was frightened and could not sleep, heard him talking aloud, quote, like a lawyer. Lewis got out his pistols. He loaded them and at some time during the early hours of October 11 shot himself in the head. The ball only grazed his skin. I get a lot of questions about that. How could a man as good with firearms as Meriwether Lewis miss? I have no answer. I've never tried to do it myself. I don't know what happens to a man's hand when he has got that pistol at his forehead. He fell heavily to the floor. Mrs. Grinder heard him exclaim, "Oh, Lord!" Lewis rose, took up his other pistol, and shot himself in his breast. The ball entered and passed downward through his body to emerge low down his backbone. He survived the second shot, too, staggered to the door of his room and called out, "Oh, madam, give me some water and heal my wounds." Lewis staggered outside, fell, crawled for some distance, raised himself by the side of a tree, then staggered back to his room. He scraped the bucket with a gourd for water, but the bucket was empty. He collapsed on his robes. At first light, the terrified Mrs. Grinder sent her children to fetch the servants. When they got to Lewis's room, they found him, quote, busily engaged in cutting himself from head to foot with his razor. Lewis saw Prunier and said to him, "I have done the business, my good servant. Give me some water." Prunier did. Lewis uncovered his side and showed them the second wound. He said, "I am no coward, but I am so strong, and it is so hard to die." He said he had tried to kill himself to deprive his enemies of the pleasure and honor of doing it. He begged his servants to take his rifle and blow out his brains, telling them not to be afraid. He would not hurt them, and they could have all the money in his trunk. Shortly after sunrise, his great heart stopped beating. On October 28, Clark got the news of Lewis's suicide from the Frankfort, Kentucky Argus of Western America newspaper. Clark was in Shelbyville on his way to Washington. George Shannon of the expedition was with him. Clark wrote his brother Jonathan, "I fear this report has too much truth. My reason for thinking it possible is found on the letter I received from him at your house." We've never found that letter. And then Clark went on, I fear the weight of his mind has overcome him. What will be the consequences? Meriwether Lewis cut off his life at the midpoint. He never reached an age of maturity. Still, enough is known about his character to allow some generalization. He was a good man in a crisis. If I was ever in a desperate situation, caught in a grass fire on the prairie, or sinking in a small boat on a big ocean, or the like, then I would want Meriwether Lewis for my leader. I am as one with Private Windsor, who, when about to slip off the bluff over the Marias River, barely managing to hold on, badly frightened, called out, "God, God, Captain, what do I do?" I, too, would instinctively trust Lewis to know what to do. In that case, he said, "Calm down. First." He was holding on to a vertical bluff, 30-foot bluff. He was holding on to it, Windsor was. And he said, "Now take your right hand, get back behind your belt. Your knife is back there. Pull that knife out. Give yourself a foothold up there. Get that thing." He walked him through it and got him out of it. He knew the wilderness as well as any American alive during his day, including Daniel Boone and William Clark, and was only surpassed later by John Coulter, who was on the expedition, and a few other of the most famous mountain men. His intense curiosity about everything new he saw around him was infectious. Certainly he would be anyone's first choice for a companion on an extended camping trip, as opposed to, say, Dick Nixon. I interviewed a guy once who had gone to college with Nixon, and he said, it was a wonderful line, he said, "You know, he's not the kind of a guy you'd like to go backpacking with." Well, Meriwether Lewis was. Certainly he would be anyone's first choice for a companion on an extended camping trip. Imagine sitting around the campfire while Meriwether Lewis talked about what he had seen that day. He had a short temper and too often acted on it. His proclivity for beating Indians who displeased him, his readiness to burn their villages or even extirpate them, recalls to mind Jefferson's point that it would be a prodigy indeed who could grow up as a slave master and keep his humanity. Lewis could not keep his boisterous passions in check. He was a man of high energy and at times impetuous, but this was tempered by his great self-discipline. He could drive himself to the point of exhaustion, then take an hour to write about the events of the day and another hour or two to make his celestial observations. His talents and skills ran wider than they did deep. He knew how to do many things, from designing and building a boat to all the necessary wilderness skills. He knew something about many of the various parts of the natural sciences. He had 4 years of formal education, typical of a Virginian of his stature and at that time living with a preacher in his house and being privately tutored. That was it for formal education. But he lived 2 years with Thomas Jefferson in the White House, and then Jefferson sent him to Philadelphia to study with all the savants at the American Philosophical Society. When Meriwether Lewis set off with his expedition, he knew more about the natural sciences, I would dare say, than any undergraduate from the University of Virginia knows today. He could describe an animal, classify a plant, name the stars, manage the sextant and other instruments, dream of empire. At none of these things, however, was he an expert or uniquely gifted. Where he was unique, truly gifted, truly great, was as an explorer, where all his talents were necessary. The most important was his ability as a leader of men. He was born to leadership and reared for it, studied it in his Army career, then exercised it on the expedition. How he led is no mystery. His techniques were time-honored. He knew his men. He saw to it that they had dry socks, enough food, sufficient clothing. He pushed them to, but never beyond the breaking point. He got out of them more than they knew they had to give. His concern for them was that of a father for his son. He was the head of the family. He could lose his temper with them and berate them in front of their fellow soldiers. He could be stern. He had a few of them take 50 lashes well laid on. And when Private Collins was caught tapping the whiskey barrel, there was 100 lashes well laid on. But in the judgment of the enlisted men, he was fair. An example, this man was an alcoholic from the time he was 19 or 20 years old. When the expedition ran out of whiskey, he ran out of whiskey. And it happened on the 4th of July of 1805. They were following the advice of Frederick the Great, who told his commanders, when you set off on a march, take plenty of beer and brandy along, enough to last for at least 4 or 5 days. When it's too late for them to turn back. Well, they ran out halfway through the expedition, and when the men ran out, Lewis ran out. He had nothing to drink but cold water for the next year and a half. He didn't make many mistakes. His orders were clear, concise, and correct. Perhaps the finest tribute to his leadership abilities came at the time of the Marias decision. They had arrived, this is in northwesternmost Montana, at the junction of the Marias, which comes out of Glacier National Park, and the Missouri, which basically comes out of Yellowstone National Park. And the question arose, which is the true Missouri? Their orders were explicit, follow the Missouri to its source, from Jefferson. But which one was the Missouri? Now, a lot of these guys of the platoon-sized force that they were leading had spent their lives on the Kentucky and the Tennessee and the Cumberland and the Missouri and the Mississippi rivers and the Ohio. They knew rivers. The men to a man said it's the right-hand fork. That's the real Missouri. The captain said, no, it's the left-hand fork. And that's the way we're going. The men said to Lewis and Clark, as Lewis recorded very cheerfully, You're wrong. But we're ready to follow you anywhere you feel proper to direct. Last fall, when General Powell, or after General Powell had announced that he was not going to be a candidate, he called me a couple of days later to say, Steve, I hope I didn't disappoint you too much. I said, you did, General. And he started to explain what a difficult decision it had been for him, and I said something that I don't ordinarily say to four-star generals, let me interrupt you. I want to tell you a little story. I told him the story of the decision at the Meriwether, which way to go. And then I quoted Lewis, and the men said, you're wrong. We'll follow you cheerfully wherever you choose to lead. And I said, General, that's just the way I feel about you. We're still trying, by the way. Not to give up. Lewis shared the work. He cooked for his men and poled a canoe. He was hunter and fisherman. From crossing the Lolo Trail to running the rapids of the Columbia, he never ordered the men to do what he wouldn't do. When it was appropriate, he shared the decision-making. All of it with Clark, of course, but much of it with the men, too, as in deciding where to spend the winter of 05-06. They were at the mouth of the Columbia, and they had three options: to stay on the north side, where there were more deer, on the south side, where there were more elk, or go back upstream to higher country where it would be drier. And Lewis decided to have a vote. Most unusual. I think he figured that we're all going to be in this together, and it's going to be a long winter. And I don't want anybody bitching about where we came. It was a great moment. It was the first election held west of the Mississippi River. And it was the first time in American history that a woman voted. Sacagawea got to vote. And it was the only time in American history that a black slave got to vote. But York cast his vote. These are some of the qualities that make for a good company commander. Lewis had them in abundance, plus some special touches that made him a much-loved commander. He had a sense, a feel for how his family was doing. He knew exactly when to take a break, when to issue a gill of whiskey, when to push for more, when to encourage, when to inspire, when to tell a joke, when to be tough. He knew how to keep a distance between himself and the men, and just how big that distance should be. He knew his profession and was proud of it, and one of the very best at it. But if he was a near-perfect Army officer, Lewis was a lousy politician. He was entirely unsuited to the job. Jefferson's appointment of Lewis to the governorship was a frightful misjudgment. Jefferson should have found him a post in Washington and given him some War Department clerks to get the publication process of the journals going. As governor, these journals ended up 8 full volumes. Jefferson expected Lewis to get them ready for the printer by himself with no help. Anyone who's done any writing can just groan at that, at the very idea of it. As governor, Lewis proved incapable of resisting the temptations of high office, incapable of managing different factions, incapable of compromise. Secretary Bates made some observations that need to be considered even while discounting the source. Lewis had been in the Army too long, just as Bates said, and was too accustomed to military ways to be a successful governor. Lewis did have a swelled head as a result of the adulation he had received. Lewis did lose his temper too often. He could never have been a successful politician. As a man, he was full of contradictions. He had been a curious, active boy, a hard-drinking, hard-riding Army officer, an intensely partisan secretary to the president, an eager explorer, a scientific scholar who paid close attention to detail, a Philadelphia playboy, and yet a man who lost the love of his life, Letitia Breckinridge, to Robert Gamble, who was a rich, layabout Virginia aristocrat, a life Lewis might have chosen for himself. He was an overeager governor and in way over his head in land speculation. He was a drug taker and an alcoholic. But he was a great company commander. The greatest of all American explorers. and in the top rank of world explorers. On July 28, 1805, when he named the Jefferson River, Lewis wrote in his journal that he had done so in honor of that illustrious personage, Thomas Jefferson, President of the United States and the author of our enterprise. In that spirit, it is fitting that Jefferson get the last word. In 1813, Jefferson wrote a one-sentence description of Lewis. He had been asked, why did you pick Lewis? Jefferson wrote a one-sentence description of Lewis that is as fine a tribute to a subordinate as any president of the United States has ever written. It is impossible to imagine higher praise from a better source. Of courage undaunted, possessing a firmness and perseverance of purpose which nothing but impossibilities could divert from its direction. Careful as a father of those committed to his charge, yet steady in the maintenance of order and discipline. Intimate with the Indian character, customs, and principles. Habituated to the hunting life. Guarded by exact observation of the vegetables and animals of his own country against losing time in the description of objects already possessed. Honest, disinterested, liberal, of sound understanding, and a fidelity to truth so scrupulous that whatever he should report would be as certain as if seen by ourselves. With all these qualifications, as if selected and implanted by nature in one body for this express purpose, I could have no hesitation in confiding the enterprise to him. Thank you.
Second-rate company commander, so I'll try to exercise that responsibility at the moment. We want book signing. In a moment or two, Professor Ambrose and I would ask your permission to leave the room first. There will be a forum, however, tomorrow morning if some of you are not able to have book signed. It'll be largely on the presidential scholarship of Steve Ambrose. After that event, there will be plenty of time for book signing, but we do have time for a couple of questions. Who'd like to ask the first question?
Yes, ma'am. In part, it was first of all due to Meriwether Lewis. The best way to avoid a fight is to avoid a fight, and he was very good at it. The Sioux tried to hold him up for ransom, for example, in South Dakota, and they came awfully close to exchanging fire, but Lewis managed to get him out of it. After Sacagawea joined up in 1805, beginning at the Mandans, which is today's Bismarck, North Dakota, yes, her presence was critical because all the Indians on the plains, when they saw the expedition, realized this is not a war party because there's a squaw and a papoose along. So her presence by itself made a big difference. Let me divert 1 second and say a little bit more about her. She is the most famous woman in American history, with more statues to Sacagawea than any other woman in this country. It's partly myth. The great myth is she was the guide. They didn't need a guide. Their orders were to follow the Missouri River. You don't need a guide to keep paddling upstream. Her real purpose was to serve as a translator, because from the Hidatsis, who lived near the Mandans, Lewis knew that the Shoshones lived on the edge of the mountains. They would have to be crossed, and they were rich in horses. They needed a translation chain. Sacagawea, who was 13 or 14 years old, and who gave birth just 2 months before they started off, was a Shoshone girl, been captured and sold. She spoke Hidatsa as well as Shoshone. Her husband, really her owner, Charbonneau, spoke Hidatsa and French, and a number of the men of the expedition had French and English. So there was the translation chain. And it turned out that Hollywood wouldn't dare invent this, that the chief of the tribe that they finally encountered was her brother, Camawiyat. And so she was very successful in negotiating the trade of European goods for the horses. We all owe her a debt that can never possibly be repaid. On the Missouri River in July of 1805, a strong wind came on. They had the sail up on one of the pirogues. It was broadsided. It was tipped. Charbonneau was at the tiller, and he went into a panic. A couple of the men couldn't swim, and they went into a panic, and panic all around. This 13 or 14-year-old girl with her papoose on her back is the one who thought to get out there and grab those journals that were floating down the Missouri River. On occasion, she was able to feed the company when they were desperate because she could use her native skills and go out and dig roots. So the Indians were varied they encountered many tribes, and all were different. All had their own national characteristics. Jefferson was fascinated by Indians, as you know, and Lewis collected their vocabularies. What's your word for water? What's your word for tree, etc. Jefferson was keen on using this material to try to figure out where these Indians had come from and how they got here. Interesting point about that. Never in his life occurred to Thomas Jefferson to try to find out what were the African words among his black slaves. Ever. The one fight was with the Blackfeet, and Lewis killed an Indian, and Private Field killed an Indian. It was a four-man party on a side expedition, and they suffered no losses. The Indian part of this story is, these guys were great ethnographers. And remember, Lewis and Clark were seeing, especially the Shoshones and the Nez Perce tribes that had never had contact with the whites other than trade goods. And so their descriptions of the Shoshones and the Nez Perce are the first and still the best we've ever had of these tribes pre-contact. Their marriage practices, their burial practices, their economy, their politics, their marriages, and so on. Yes?
Supposedly, when foreign soldiers in the territory said that the adjustments to America's power created a naval power of people that were divided in. I was wondering to what extent Jefferson and Wilson were consciously aware that bringing in this immense character, assuming population called the city now, to get to a special North American
We all of us stand in awe of Thomas Jefferson's mind. And all of us are struck by his many contradictions. The greatest champion of human liberty that ever lived. And a slaveholder. He said the next generation of Virginians will free the slaves. Our generation is ready to do it. But of all of Mr. Jefferson's contributions, none exceeds this. His mind encompassed the continent. He dared to have a thought that nobody had ever had before, that you could have one nation that stretched from sea to shining sea, governed by the same Constitution, so that the people living west of the Mississippi River would have exactly the same rights as the original 13 states. This was a leap of imagination that no superlative can capture. Yeah, he was thinking very big from the beginning. The expedition, as he set it up, was going to be an invasion of what was then Spanish territory. Jefferson was determined that this country would stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and more than any other person, he made it happen, and his number one agent was Meriwether Lewis. In a river, and he'd see the next bend, and he'd say, that's 3/4 of a mile. Go around that bend, that's a half a mile. People want to know, how did they preserve their specimen? Well, Jefferson had taught Lewis taxidermy, and then sent him to Philadelphia to study with Dr. Persh, who taught him how to press plants. And a lot of people in this audience are old enough to remember when we used to do that in our biology and botany classes. And it's a terribly time-consuming process. But that's how he did that. Well, a bit from the book and then your questions. July 4, 1804. The men, they were in Missouri. They were north of, on the Missouri-Kansas border, north of Kansas City. On July 4, the men ushered in the day with the firing of the cannon. Private Joseph Field got bitten by a snake. Captain Lewis treated him with a poultice of Peruvian bark that drew the poison. At noon, the party pulled ashore at the mouth of a creek of some 15 yards wide, coming out of an extensive prairie on the left. As they ate, the captains questioned the voyageurs. These were French Canadians who lived in St. Louis who had been signed up to get that keelboat upriver. And the voyageurs told them, no, nobody has named this creek. The captains thereupon named it Independence Creek. The expedition pulled over for the night on the site of an old Kansas Indian town. We camped in the plains, Clark wrote, one of the most beautiful plains I ever saw. Open and beautifully diversified, with hills and valleys all presenting themselves to the river, covered with grass and a few scattering trees, a handsome creek meandering through. The captains ordered an extra gill of whiskey distributed. As they sipped their portions, they took in their surroundings and were quite overwhelmed. The country was covered with a sweet and nourishing grass, interspersed with copses of trees, quote, spreading their lofty branches over pools, springs, or brooks of fine water, groups of shrubs covered with the most delicious fruit, is to be seen in every direction. And nature appears to have exerted herself to beautify the scenery by the variety of flowers, delicately and highly flavored, raised above the grass, which strikes and perfumes the sensation and amuses the mind. At sunset, the men fired the cannon. This was the first ever 4th of July celebration held west of the Mississippi River. Perhaps the captains grew philosophical under the influence of the whiskey, as happens to earnest young men carrying heavy responsibilities who find themselves in the Garden of Eden. As full dark comes on and the campfire burns down on the nation's birthday. Clark's last journal entry that day, so magnificent that he was an alcoholic. He was a Virginian. It went with that territory that he was over his head in land speculation in Missouri. He had grown accustomed to writing out checks on the government whenever he needed anything. He had had a blank check from President Jefferson. But by the time he got to St. Louis to take up his duties as governor of Upper Louisiana, Jefferson wasn't president anymore. And as far as Madison was concerned, the Lewis and Clark expedition, that was yesterday. And the government started refusing his promissory notes. And as soon as word got to St. Louis that the government wasn't paying up on Lewis's signature, he was besieged with creditors. He was ruined financially. He believed that the expedition had been a failure, which is a startling thing to say because it had succeeded in the number one object, which was to just get there and get back and tell us what's out there. Remember, this was 2/3 of a continent. This was the biggest unexplored territory in the world. And all of these Enlightenment figures were just so eager to find what the hell is out there. And he had done that. The scenery. in a country thus situated far removed from the civilized world, to be enjoyed by nothing but the buffalo, elk, deer, and bear in which it abounds, and the savage Indians. Possibly the captain's puzzled over why God had created such a place and failed to put Virginians in it. Or failed to put it in Virginia. You know the story of the expedition, and I won't get into it except whatever you want to ask in question time. After the expedition, Meriwether Lewis was the nation's first celebrity, post-Revolutionary War. The great national hero, spoken of as a possible president someday. Feasted and feted at the American Philosophical Society, New Year's Day, 1807 at the White House. Praised, honored, glorified, and he fell apart. He suffered from malaria, for which he took opium. And it was within 2 years of the end of the expedition, a pill in the morning, and then a pill at noon, and then a pill in the evening. He was a frontier officer. It went with the territory. Do a bit of reading, not terribly long, don't panic. And then leave plenty of time for questions, because I find on this book that people really do have a lot of questions, and they're different from the questions that I get when I talk about Eisenhower or Nixon. People want to know how they felt about things. I get asked so often to talk about Kay Summersby, for example. And with Nixon, people want to know when he said, but John, that would be wrong. Did he mean wrong politically, or wrong morally, or wrong legally, or... But with Lewis and Clark, people want to know how they do it. How the hell do you go across a continent before there are trains, before there are steamboats, when nothing moves faster than the speed of a horse? And the questions are intriguing to me as well. Just to anticipate a couple, people want to know, how did they measure distance? William Clark made the map from St. Louis to Astoria, Oregon. And it's about 2,781 miles, and he was off by a mile. Now, how did he do this? Well, he did it by line of sight. He'd come around a bend.